42 On the morning of April 11, 1945, First Lieutenant Merit Dwayne Francis banked his Piper L4H Grasshopper over a muddy road near Dannenberg, Germany, watching a German motorcycle with a sidecar racing east through the trees below. He was 24 years old, had flown 142 combat missions, and had 0 air-to-air kills. The 5th Armored Division had pushed to within 48 miles of Berlin. Behind Francis, somewhere in the low clouds, 500 American tanks and self-propelled guns rolled east at 12 miles per hour. The war was ending. Germany was collapsing. But Wehrmacht units still held isolated pockets of ground, and some of them still had radios. Francis flew an artillery observation aircraft, fabric stretched over a welded steel tube frame, 65 horsepower, a maximum speed of 85 miles per hour, no armor, no guns, and no radios capable of reaching friendly fighters. His mission was straightforward: fly ahead of the division, locate German positions, radio coordinates back to the howitzers, and stay alive. His observer, First Lieutenant William Martin, sat in the rear seat with binoculars and a map board. They had been airborne since 0700, scanning roads and tree lanes for targets. The motorcycle had appeared 10 minutes earlier, moving quickly along a secondary road parallel to the American advance. Francis descended to 400 feet for a better look. The motorcycle kept going. The driver wore a Wehrmacht field gray uniform. The man in the sidecar carried what appeared to be a radio pack, a courier, likely transporting reports on American positions back to a command post somewhere to the east. Then Martin tapped Francis on the shoulder and pointed upward. 700 feet above them, a Fiesler Phi 156 Storch drifted through the clouds. Francis recognized the silhouette instantly: a high-wing monoplane with fixed landing gear and a single engine, the Luftwaffe's counterpart to the L4 Grasshopper, an artillery spotter and reconnaissance aircraft. The Germans used them exactly as the Americans used the Grasshopper, to locate targets, adjust artillery fire, and report enemy movements. The Storch was larger than the L4, faster, more powerful, and at that moment it was flying directly toward the 5th Armored Division's lead elements. Francis pulled back on the stick and climbed. The small Continental engine strained as the Grasshopper gained altitude slowly, fabric rippling against the slipstream. Martin kept his binoculars trained on the Storch. The German pilot had not seen them yet. He flew straight and level, heading west toward the American tanks. Francis grasped the danger immediately. If that Storch reached German lines, its crew would radio precise coordinates for every Sherman, every M7 Priest, every supply truck in the column. German artillery would receive perfect targeting data. The 5th Armored would roll straight into a prepared kill zone. Men would die. Francis had seen it happen before. On September 19, 1944, near Ericourt, France, German observers had spotted American armored movements. 30 minutes later, 88mm shells rained down on B Company. 11 tanks were destroyed, and 27 men were killed before the column could scatter. Francis considered calling for help, but American fighters operated at 10,000 feet or higher. By the time they descended, the Storch would be gone. By the time they located it again, German artillery officers would already have their coordinates. The Grasshopper carried no weapons. The Army did not arm observation planes: too much weight, not enough power. The L4 was built for a single purpose: fly low, find targets, and get out. But Francis and Martin each carried a standard issue M19 11.45 caliber pistol, 7 rounds per magazine, 1 spare magazine each, 28 bullets total. If you want to see how Francis decided to attack a German military aircraft with nothing but sidearms, please hit that like button. It helps us share these stories with more people who care about real history. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Francis. The Storch was now 600 feet above them and slightly to the east, still flying straight, still unaware of the small American plane climbing through the clouds below. Francis glanced at his pistol in its holster, then at the Storch, then down at the road where 500 American tanks were rolling into what could become a killing zone. He reached down and unlatched his door. Wind slammed into the cockpit. Martin did the same on his side. Both doors swung open against the slipstream. Francis drew his .45 and chambered around. Behind him, Martin did the same. The Grasshopper climbed toward the Storch at 60 miles per hour, 2 men in a fabric observation plane, 2 pistols, 1 enemy aircraft. Francis pushed the throttle forward and aimed for a point just ahead of the Storch's flight path. Then he dove.
The Grasshopper dropped 300 feet in 12 seconds.
The Storch swelled in the windscreen, 500 feet, 400, 300. The German crew still had not looked down. They flew straight and level, the pilot focused on the horizon, the observer likely studying his map or writing down coordinates. At 200 feet of separation, Francis leveled out and slid in behind the Storch 80 yards back, then 60, then 40. The German aircraft filled his vision. He could see the observer's head through the rear canopy glass, see the black Bokenkreuz crosses on the wings, see scratches in the paint where tree branches had scraped the fabric during low-altitude missions. At 20 yards, Martin fired first 3 shots. The sharp cracks cut through the engine noise. Francis could not tell if any rounds struck home. The Storch continued straight ahead. Francis squeezed the trigger once, twice, 3 times. The pistol bucked in his hand. Empty brass casings spun past his face into the slipstream. He fired again. The Storch was so close he could see rivets in the tail structure. Then the German pilot finally noticed them. The Storch banked hard to the left. Francis yanked the stick and followed. The Grasshopper turned inside the German aircraft's radius. The L-4 was slower than the Storch, but it could turn tighter, designed for spotting artillery in narrow valleys and skimming treetops, maximum maneuverability at minimal speed. The Storch climbed. Francis climbed after it. Both aircraft spiraled upward through 500 feet, 600, 700. The German pilot was trying to gain altitude and speed, trying to escape, but the Grasshopper stayed with him. Francis fired his last 2 rounds. The slide locked back on an empty magazine. He had no idea if he had hit anything. The Storch showed no signs of damage, no smoke, no loss of control. Nothing. He needed to reload. The problem was simple. He needed both hands to drop the empty magazine, retrieve a fresh one from his belt, and slam it home. But he also needed both hands to fly the airplane. The Grasshopper had no autopilot, no trim system sophisticated enough to hold altitude and heading in turbulent air. Francis jammed the control stick between his knees. His left hand dropped the empty magazine. It tumbled out through the open door and disappeared toward the German countryside 800 feet below. His right hand pulled the spare magazine from his belt. 7 fresh rounds. He slapped it into the pistol grip and released the slide. The weapon was ready. The stick slipped between his knees. The Grasshopper's nose dropped. Francis grabbed the controls with his left hand and pulled back. The little plane leveled out. He had lost maybe 50 feet of altitude, and the Storch had gained some distance, but not much. Martin was also reloading. Francis could hear the metallic click of a fresh magazine seating home behind him. The Storch was now circling, not running. The German pilot had apparently decided he could not outrun the American plane, so he was trying to outmaneuver it instead. Turning, diving, climbing, trying to shake the Grasshopper off his tail. It did not work. Every turn the Storch made, Francis matched it tighter. Every climb, he followed. The L-4 stayed within 50 yards of the German aircraft. Sometimes closer. The 2 planes spiraled through the morning sky above Dannenberg like hawks fighting over territory. Francis closed to 30 feet close enough to see the German observer pointing at them through the canopy glass. Close enough to see the pilot's leather flight helmet. Close enough to see their faces. He fired. Martin fired. Both pistols cracked in rapid succession. Francis saw his muzzle flashes reflecting off the Storch's tail. Saw Martin's tracerless rounds disappearing toward the enemy fuselage. Then he saw something else. A spiderweb pattern appeared in the Storch's windscreen, a bullet hole. Then another. The German aircraft's nose dipped slightly. The pilot jerked the controls. The Storch pitched up then rolled right. Frankency stayed with him. He fired again and again. The pistol slide locked back. Empty, but Martin was still shooting. Francis watched his observer empty his magazine into the Storch's right wing,
an engine cowling.
The Storch's propeller stuttered.
Black smoke puffed from the engine. Not a lot, just a thin trail, but enough.
The German pilot pushed his nose down and dove toward the trees. The Storch descended through 600 feet, 500, 400. The thin smoke trail
thickened. The German pilot was heading for a clearing near the road, trying to make an emergency landing, trying to save his aircraft and his crew. Francis followed him down. The Grasshopper stayed 30 foot behind the Storch's tail. Martin kept his pistol aimed through the open door, but held fire. Both magazines were empty now. No ammunition left. 28 rounds expended. The fight was over. At 100 feet, the Storch leveled out over the clearing. The pilot was good, even with a damaged engine, even with smoke trailing from the cowling. He brought the aircraft in steady. The fixed landing gear touched down.
The wheels rolled across grass and mud.
Then the right wing tip caught the ground.
The Storch pivoted. The right wing crumpled.
Metal shrieked. Fabric tore. The aircraft spun 90 degrees in a spray of mud and grass.
The landing gear collapsed. The propeller struck dirt and shattered.
Pieces of wood blade flew in different directions.
The fuselage twisted and stopped.
The engine quit.
Silence replaced the sound of tearing metal.
Smoke continued to drift from the cowling, but no fire. The Storch sat in
the clearing, broken, but intact. The cabin appeared undamaged.
Frankency circled once. The clearing was maybe 200 yards long, wide enough for the Grasshopper. Soft ground, but not swampy. No visible obstacles. He dropped to 50 feet and lined up his approach. The problem was location.
Francis had no idea exactly where he was.
He had been chasing the Storch for maybe 4 minutes, circling, diving, climbing. He had lost track of landmarks, lost track of heading.
The 5th Armored Division was somewhere west, maybe 3 miles, maybe
5, maybe 10.
And he was landing in Germany, somewhere east of American
lines, somewhere inside territory that might still hold Wehrmacht units, might hold Volkerm Home Guard, might hold nothing but retreating soldiers and abandoned equipment. He did not know. The Grasshopper touched down 70 yards from the wrecked Storch. Francis cut the engine.
The propeller windmilled to a
stop. He and Martin climbed out.
Both men drew their pistols.
Both magazines
were empty, but the Germans would not know that. They approached the Storch on foot.
Mud sucked at their boots. The
morning air smelled like aviation fuel and burned oil.
Francis could see movement inside the cabin. The canopy was intact. Someone was alive in there. The German crew was trying to get out.
The pilot pushed his door open.
It stuck halfway.
He shoved harder.
The door swung free.
He climbed out onto the wing, then dropped to the ground.
Feld. Webel rank insignia.
Sergeant, maybe 30 years old.
No visible injuries. He stood
beside the wreckage and raised his hands.
The observer came out next. Younger, maybe 22. He tried to step down
from the wing, but his right leg buckled.
He fell, hit the ground hard.
Did not get up, just laid there in the mud next to the landing gear.
Francis
and Martin moved closer.
30 feet 20.
The pilot kept his hands raised.
He was not
reaching for a weapon, not moving toward the trees, just standing there beside his wrecked aircraft with his hands up. But Francis was watching the Trien.
They were alone in a clearing somewhere in Germany. 2 American officers, 2
German aircrew, no backup, no radio contact with the 5th Armored, no way
to call for help.
And somewhere in those trees, there might be more Wehrmacht soldiers.
Might be a German patrol.
Might be a command post that had heard the aircraft circling and diving and shooting.
The wounded observer was bleeding. Francis could see it now. The man's right boot was dark with blood. A bullet had hit him. Probably during the final pass when Martin emptied his magazine into the Storch's cabin.
The round had gone through the aircraft's thin fabric skin and struck the observer somewhere in the foot or ankle.
The German pilot shouted something, pointing at his observer, pointing at the blood.
His voice was urgent, but Francis could not understand the words.
Martin capped.
His empty pistol aimed at the pilot. Francis moved toward the wounded man. Francis knelt beside the wounded observer. The German was maybe 22 years old, pale, sweating despite the cold
morning air.
His right boot had a hole just above the ankle.
Blood soaked through the leather and into the mud beneath him.
Francis had taken pre-med courses at college, enough to understand basic field medicine, enough that his battalion called him Doc.
He pulled out
his first aid kit. Sulfa powder, bandages, morphine syringe, standard army issue. The observer stared at him, terrified, probably expecting to be shot, probably expecting this American pilot to leave him bleeding in the mud while they took his aircraft commander
prisoner. That was what happened to downed air crew sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. Francis cut the boot away
with his pocket knife. The bullet had entered just above the ankle bone and exited through the sole of the foot.
Clean through.
No bone shattered, no major arteries severed, but it was bleeding heavily, and the man could not
walk.
He poured sulfa powder into both wounds. The observer flinched, but made
no sound.
Francis wrapped the foot with gauze from the kit, tight enough to slow the bleeding, not tight enough to cut
circulation. He tied it off and sat back.
The German pilot was still standing with his hands raised.
Martin
stood 10 feet away with his empty pistol aimed at the pilot's chest.
The situation was stable for now, but only for now. Francis looked at his watch.
9:58, they had been on the ground for 6
minutes.
The 5th Armored Division was somewhere west, probably 3 to 5 miles. Based on how far they had chased the Storch, but Francis had no map coordinates, no landmarks he recognized. No radio contact, and they were behind German lines.
Maybe not deep behind lines.
The Wehrmacht was collapsing.
Units were retreating east or surrendering.
But pockets of resistance still existed.
Francis had seen it all. Weak
American columns driving through abandoned villages, then suddenly taking fire from a cellar or a church tower.
Die-hard officers, fanatic SS troops, Volkerm civilians with Panzerfausts. A sound came from the trees. Francis froze. Martin heard it, too. Both men turned toward the tree and 70 yards east. The sound came again. Voices. German voices. Multiple speakers getting closer. The pilot heard them, too. His eyes widened. He said something in German.
Fast, urgent, pointing at the trees, pointing at Francis and Martin.
Then pointing west toward American lines. Francis understood without knowing the words. There were German
soldiers in those trees, and they were coming to investigate the crashed aircraft.
The pilot was warning them to
run, but Francis could not run. The wounded observer could not walk, could not even stand.
If Francis and Martin left now, they could reach the Grasshopper in 30 seconds, start the engine in another 20, take off in 45
seconds total, be airborne, and heading west before whoever was in those trees reached the clearing.
But the wounded
German would be left behind, bleeding, unable to move, with American bullets in his foot and American bandages on his wounds. When his own troops found him, they would know he had been treated by Americans, would know the Americans had been here, had landed, had taken the pilot prisoner, maybe. The voices in the
Trees were getting closer. Francis could hear branches snapping, boots on dead leaves.
Multiple men, at least 4 or
5, maybe more.
Martin grabbed his arm and pointed toward the grasshopper.
Time to go. Time to leave. Get airborne. Get back to American lines.
Report the torch.
Destroyed. Mission accomplished.
But Francis looked at the wounded observer, at the bandages he had just applied, at
the terrified kid lying in the mud.
He had learned something in pre-med courses at Seattle Pacific College, before the war, before the army, before 142 combat missions over France and Belgium and Germany. He had learned that doctors helped people.
All people, even enemies.
The voices were maybe 50 yards away now, still in the trees, still invisible, but close, very close. Francis made his decision. He grabbed the wounded
observer under the arms and lifted. Understood immediately.
He holstered his pistol and grabbed the
German's legs.
Together, they carried him toward the grasshopper. The pilot followed, hands still raised, not running, not fighting, just following 2 American officers who were carrying his wounded crewman toward their
aircraft instead of leaving him behind.
They reached the grasshopper in 40 seconds. The wounded observer weighed maybe 160 pounds, dead weight. His injured
foot dragged in the mud.
He was conscious, but not helping, probably in shock, probably terrified that these Americans were going to throw him in their aircraft and then shoot him somewhere over the trees.
Martin climbed into the rear seat.
Francis and the German pilot lifted the wounded observer
up.
Martin grabbed him under the arms and pulled him into the cramped cabin. There was barely enough room. The L4 was designed for 2 men with maps and
binoculars, not 3 men, including a casualty with a bandaged foot. The
voices from the trees were closer now, maybe 40 yards.
Francis could hear German words clearly, commands, questions. Someone was calling out, probably asking if anyone was alive in the crashed Storch. The pilot stood
beside the grasshopper's wing, looking at Francis, looking at the trees, looking at his wounded observer now cramped into the rear seat of an American spotter plane.
He could run, could disappear into the trees, could rejoin his own troops, could tell them 2 American officers were trying to take off from the clearing.
Francis pointed at the open front seat.
The
pilot hesitated for 3 seconds, then climbed in. Francis pushed in after him.
2 men in a seat designed for 1.
The pilot sat on Francis' lap, arms pinned.
No room to move, no way to fight.
The cabin smelled like aviation fuel and
blood and fear.
Francis reached around the pilot and grabbed the stick. His right hand found the throttle.
He pushed it forward. The little Continental engine coughed once, twice, then caught. The propeller spun up. The grasshopper vibrated. Figures emerged from the tree in 5 soldiers, Wehrmacht uniforms, rifles. 1 had a Panzer Faust.
They saw the grasshopper, saw its engine running, saw Americans in the
cockpit.
They started shouting, started running across the clearing.
Francis released the brake. The grasshopper rolled forward. Slow at first. The tail came up. Speed increased. 30 miles per hour, 40.
The German soldiers were 100 yards away, running hard.
1 dropped to a knee and
raised his rifle.
50 miles per hour.
Francis pulled back on the stick.
The grasshopper lifted off. The wheels left the mud.
The aircraft climbed through 20 feet 30.
A rifle shot cracked somewhere behind them. Francis did not know if it hit, did not look back, just kept climbing. 60 feet, 80, 100. The clearing disappeared below. Trees passed underneath.
The German soldiers grew smaller.
Another shot. Then nothing. The grasshopper climbed west at 500 feet per minute. Francis checked his watch.
07, they had been on the ground for 15 minutes. The pilot sat rigid on his lap, arms trapped, staring through the windscreen at nothing.
Behind them,
Martin held the wounded observer upright. The German's head lolled against Martin's shoulder, still breathing,
still alive. Francis spotted American tanks 12 minutes later. A column of Shermans moving east on a road below.
He circled once, waggled his wings, descended to 200 feet, and looked for a place to land. Found a field north of the road. Soft ground but flat.
Good enough. The grasshopper touched down at 10:21. Francis cut the engine. Tank
crews were already running toward them across the field. Sergeant with a Thompson submachine gun.
3 privates with M1 rifles. They surrounded the aircraft, weapons raised, ready to shoot if the Germans tried anything.
Francis climbed out with the pilot still in front of him, hands up, showing he was
American, showing the German was a prisoner. Martin climbed out next, then
helped the wounded observer down from the rear seat. The kid nearly collapsed. Martin caught him, lowered him to the
grass. The sergeant stared at them, at the tiny observation plane, at the two
German air crew, at the blood-soaked bandages. He said something Francis did not quite hear over the sound of tank
engines on the road. Francis explained in 30 seconds. Chased a Storch, shot it
down with pistols, landed, bandaged the wounded German, got jumped by Wehrmacht troops, took off with both Germans, flew west, landed here.
The whole story, start to finish. The sergeant just nodded.
He had probably seen stranger things in the past 11 months.
He detailed 2 men to take the prisoners back to the division intelligence section.
Another man offered Francis and
Martin Cantan's water. They drank. The wounded observer looked back at Francis as the tank crews led him away.
The German said something. Francis did not understand the words, but understood the
meaning. Thank you for the bandages, for not leaving him to bleed out in the mud, for saving his life even though they were enemies. Francis never learned his name, never learned the pilot's name.
Never found out if they were important, never found out what happened to them after that morning.
They disappeared into the prisoner system.
2 more Germans among millions.
2 more enemies who became statistics.
But
for 15 minutes in a clearing near Dannenberg, they had been something else.
They had been wounded men who
needed help,
and Francis had helped them.
Francis and Martin flew back to the 71st
Armored Field Artillery Battalion at 11:15.
The Grasshopper landed at the battalion's forward airstrip. A dirt
road widened into a makeshift runway.
3 other L4s sat parked under camouflage netting. Mechanics were working on one, changing spark plugs, replacing fabric torn by ground fire. The battalion operations officer met them at the flight line. Major Combat Infantry badge. He listened to Francis's report. Listened to the whole story.
Storch spotted, chase, pistol fight, crash landing, German troops, escape.
With prisoners. The major wrote it down. Every detail, then told Francis to write
an after-action report, full account, submitted by 1700 hours.
Francis spent 2 hours writing.
He used simple language, factual statements, times, and
locations, what happened and when it happened. No speculation, no drama, just
the events as they occurred. He finished at 13:30, submitted the report to battalion headquarters, then went to
find food.
The 5th Armored Division pushed deeper into Germany over the next 3 days.
American forces reached the Ella River on April 12, 45 mi from Berlin, close enough that Francis could see smoke from the city during high-altitude reconnaissance missions, close enough that rumors started spreading. Would they push to Berlin? Would they race the Soviets? Would the war end in a week or a month?
It ended in less than a month. Hitler killed himself on April 30. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7. Victory in Europe Day came on May 8. Church bells rang across liberated France and Belgium.
Soldiers fired weapons into the air. Tank crews
painted victory slogans on their Shermans. The European war was finished 3 years, 11 months, and 13 days since D-Day.
It was done.
Francis had flown 149 combat missions, 7 of them after bringing down the Storch, followed by 7 more days of scanning roads and tree lanes for targets that grew scarcer with each passing day. By May 1, most German formations had ceased fighting. By May 5, most had surrendered. By May 8, it was truly over. On April 24, his battalion commander recommended him for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation referenced the encounter with the Storch, the decision to attack an enemy aircraft armed only with sidearms, the successful forced landing of the hostile plane, the capture of 2 enemy aircrewmen, and extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. The recommendation moved upward through channels, division headquarters, corps headquarters, army headquarters, and then it vanished. Not officially, not permanently, but it disappeared into the vast military bureaucracy struggling to process 10 million soldiers, airmen, and sailors at the conclusion of the largest war in human history.
The recommendation existed. Someone had written it. Someone had stamped it. Someone had forwarded it onward. But somewhere along that chain, it stopped. Francis waited. Weeks went by. The division transitioned to occupation duties.
Francis flew administrative sorties, mail deliveries, supply inspections, liaison flights, nothing hazardous, nothing that required pistol duels at 700 feet, just routine peacetime flying over a defeated Germany. The Distinguished Flying Cross never arrived.
He did receive other decorations: the Bronze Star for rescuing a wounded forward observer in September 1944,
the Air Medal for sustained operational flights against the enemy.
Both were legitimate. Both were earned. But neither recognized shooting down an enemy aircraft with a pistol. In October 1945, the 5th Armored Division sailed home. Francis arrived at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, on October 2nd.
The division was deactivated on October 11. Soldiers dispersed.
Some remained in the Army. Most returned to civilian life.
Francis went home to Wenatchee, Washington, back to a life without combat missions, German aircraft, or pistol fights at 700 feet. He married Joanne Hulson in March 1947, found work, and built a family. The war became something that had happened long ago. The Storch became a story he told occasionally at reunions and veterans gatherings. When asked what he had done during the war, he talked about the pistol fight, about shooting down a German observation aircraft with a .45, about landing and bandaging the wounded crewman.
Most people didn't believe him.
It sounded too much like a movie, too dramatic, too improbable, but it was true. And somewhere in Army records, a recommendation for a Distinguished Flying Cross sat filed, forgotten, buried in the paperwork of a war that had ended 22 years earlier.
Then, in 1966, someone uncovered it.
Cornelius Ryan was writing a book about the final days of World War II in Europe, a massive research effort titled The Last Battle. Ryan interviewed hundreds of veterans, American, British, German, and Soviet, and sifted through military archives, unit histories, after-action reports, and personal accounts. He was searching for stories that revealed what the war's end looked like on the ground, what soldiers experienced during those final chaotic weeks as Germany collapsed. Someone mentioned Francis, a veteran of the 5th Armored Division, and claimed he had shot down a German plane with a pistol.
Ryan investigated. He found the April 11, 1945 after-action report.
He found witness statements. He found the recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross and discovered it had never been processed, never approved, never denied, nearly filed away and forgotten.
Ryan included the story in his book.
It wasn't long, perhaps 2 pages, but it contained all the essential details: the Storch, the pistol duel, the crash landing, the wounded German, the escape. He also included a footnote stating that Lieutenant Francis had been recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross but had never received it, and that despite accomplishing what may have been the most unusual aerial victory in the European theater, the Army had never officially recognized it.
The Last Battle was published in 1966 and became a bestseller.
Hundreds of thousands of readers learned about the final drive on Berlin, Soviet forces storming the city from the east, American armies halting at the Elbe, Hitler's suicide in his bunker, and the Reich's ultimate collapse. And some readers noticed the footnote about a lieutenant from Washington state who shot down a German plane with a .45 caliber pistol and never received his medal.
One of those readers was Senator Henry Scoop Jackson of Washington.
He represented Francis' home state and had served in Congress since 1941. He understood military bureaucracy, how paperwork vanished, how recommendations were lost, how deserving soldiers sometimes slipped through the cracks. Jackson's office contacted Francis in early 1967. They asked if the story was accurate, asked if he had truly never received the Distinguished Flying Cross, asked whether he wanted the senator to investigate.
Francis confirmed everything. Yes, it was accurate.
Yes, he had never received the medal. Yes, he would appreciate help correcting the record.
Jackson went to work.
His staff retrieved files from the National Archives. They found the original recommendation dated April 24, 1945. They found supporting statements from Major William Martin. They found the battalion commander's endorsement. They traced the paperwork through 5th Armored Division headquarters, saw that it had been approved at division level, forwarded to 9th Army headquarters in May 1945, and stopped there. It had not been rejected or denied. It had simply halted. 9th Army was dissolving.
Units were redeploying.
Staff officers were closing bases, processing discharges, and shipping equipment home.
Someone had likely set the file aside intending to complete it later, then transferred, demobilized, or forgot. The recommendation sat untouched for 22 years. Jackson pressed the case through the Department of Defense. Letters were sent.
Phone calls were made.
Follow-ups happened weekly.
The machinery of bureaucracy moved slowly, but it moved. By February 1967, the Distinguished Flying Cross was officially approved. By March, a presentation ceremony was arranged. On March 13, 1967, Captain Merritt Dwayne Francis stood at Holman Field in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was 45 years old, a commercial pilot, a husband, a father, a civilian who had not worn a uniform in 22 years. But that day he wore his old Army uniform, ribbons on his chest, captain's bars on his shoulders. He had remained in the Army Reserve after the war, earned 2 promotions, and never entirely stopped being a soldier. Major General Lucius D. Clay stood before him, the commander of the Berlin airlift, a man who understood what it meant to fly dangerous missions in small aircraft. Clay held the Distinguished Flying Cross, blue ribbon with red and white stripes, a bronze cross with propeller blades at the angles, simple, dignified, and 22 years overdue. He pinned the medal to Francie's chest, shook his hand, and spoke of extraordinary achievement, of heroism, of an action that embodied the American spirit. Francie stood at attention, thanked him, said it was an honor, said he had only done his duty. From a clearing near Dannenberg to an airfield in Minnesota, from combat to recognition, from war to peace, the medal felt light on his chest, but it felt right. The story of the pistol fight at 700 feet became known after 1967, not famous, not legendary, but recognized.
Aviation historians wrote about it. Military journals published analyses.
The Distinguished Flying Cross Society recorded Francie's as having one of the most unusual aerial victories in American history. Yet what made it remarkable was not only the pistols, or the fragile fabric aircraft fighting like fighters, or the crash landing, or the wounded German, or the escape through enemy territory.
What made it extraordinary was the choice.
On the morning of April 11, 1945, when Francie saw the Storch heading toward American lines, he had options. He could have called for fighters. He could have turned back to report its location. He could have shadowed it from a distance and marked it for artillery.
All were reasonable, safe options that did not require attacking a military aircraft with a sidearm.
But they would have taken time, and time meant the Storch would reach German lines, radio coordinates, and give German artillery the precise positions of 500 American tanks. Men would die, just as 27 men had died at Aracourt when German observers spotted them.
So Francis chose differently.
He opened his door, drew his pistol, and flew straight at an enemy aircraft because waiting was not acceptable, because calling for help was too slow, because sometimes the only way to save lives is to risk your own. That decision defined the kind of soldier he was and the kind of man he became. Francis continued flying after the war, commercial routes, cargo flights, passenger service, logging thousands of hours in aircraft far larger and more powerful than the L-4 Grasshopper.
But he never forgot April 11th.
He never forgot the Storch above Dannenberg, the weight of the pistol in his hand, the sound of bullets tearing through fabric, or the face of the wounded German observer in the mud. He died on May 5, 2004, at his home in Chelan, Washington, 82 years old, 59 years after the war in Europe ended. He left behind his wife, children, grandchildren, a lifetime of civilian flying, and a drawer of medals, including the Distinguished Flying Cross he waited 22 years to receive. And he left behind a story of two men in a tiny observation plane who chose to fight back, of pistols, fabric, and courage at 700 feet, of landing behind enemy lines to help a wounded foe, of doing what needed to be done even when the odds said it could not be done. The last dogfight on the Western Front was not fought by P-51 Mustangs, Spitfires, or Thunderbolts. It was fought by an L-4 Grasshopper with 65 horsepower and 2.45 caliber pistols. It was fought by men who understood that wars are not won solely by the biggest weapons or the fastest aircraft, but by soldiers who recognize what must be done and do it, no matter how small their plane, how inadequate their weapons, or how impossible the mission.
Francis proved that on April 11, 1945.
He proved it again when he treated his enemy's wounds instead of abandoning him. And he proved it one final time by waiting 22 years for recognition without complaint, without demands, without surrender.
If this story moved you, do us a favor and hit that like button.
Every like helps these stories reach more people.
Subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten history every day.
Stories of pilots who saved lives with pistols and courage. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, whether the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or elsewhere. This community spans the world.
You are not just a viewer, you are part of keeping these memories alive.
Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Dwayne Francis is never lost to silence.